agroforestry has long timelines, complex systems. The returns do not fit the standard risk models. So for most investors, it still looks unfamiliar, hard to guarantee, difficult to underwrite. So this is where blended finance becomes essential.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You just heard from Isabel Britez, who is Head of Financial Innovation at Belterra in Brazil. Belterra is an organization that works to make regenerative and sustainable farming economically viable. And that's important because at the moment, the financial system that's in place for farmers there means that they are more likely to benefit from deforestation. And it's not just Brazil. Many countries still rely on sustainable farming methods. My colleague Haley St. Dennis is IHRB's Head of Just Transitions. In this episode, you'll hear Haley and Isabel discuss a real-world example of a just transition for farmers and how it's being financed. But first, I had a few of my own questions for Haley. Haley, what brings us to Brazil and to the story of these farmers?
Well, at IHRB, we have been exploring just transitions happening on the ground, from Australia to Spain, India to Brazil. Just transitions being this idea that you can achieve, not only a cleaner and greener future, but really a fairer one. So we have been researching in depth and featuring immersive accounts of the experiences and the people perspectives and relationships behind some of the most successful cases we can find. And our story from Brazil follows farmers like Zé Maria in Tomeaçu, who have transformed degraded land into really highly productive agroforests. And we also investigate the role that business can play in making models like this really viable at scale. And so my conversation with Isabel really builds on that story. But rather than retelling it, in this episode, I really wanted to speak to Isabel about how this just transition is being financed in real time. And this is a challenge that almost every country and every institution is going through, how to create a just transition for farmers that is sustainable and frankly profitable. And so Isabel is someone who's been grappling with the really practical questions of how regenerative agriculture can work for farmers and for markets. And so this is not a case study after the fact. This is really a live transition and a live conversation about what it takes to actually build and nurture a just transition right now.
So we've talked about agroforestry. What is it exactly?
Yeah, it's actually quite an ancient practice in many ways that's getting sort of a modern twist. It's where trees and crops, sometimes livestock, are deliberately grown and raised together on the same land. And this is in ways that really genuinely mimics natural ecosystems. It's an approach rooted in indigenous knowledge and has been practiced for thousands of years. But now it's really being re-examined through the lens of sort of modern science, finance, and markets as a very serious climate solution. So these different crops come to fruition at different times. They mature and can be harvested. So those benefits are that agroforestry can diversify income streams for farmers, whilst also enhancing the biodiversity and protecting against extreme weather.
That sounds like a win-win for farmers, and yet there are barriers to them being able to take this up. What are those barriers?
Yeah, and Isabel and I will talk about more of this, but in a nutshell, when you grow different crops, they yield at different times, of course. So that can mean an income gap for farmers, as that kind of first crop might not make money for the first couple of years, up to 3 years, and that's actually quite quick by many agricultural standards. At the same time, agriculture in Brazil is currently geared toward extensive cattle ranching, very extractive in its model. So raising livestock in large areas of land, which means clearing large areas of forest. The system really rewards this scale rather than rewarding diversity and forest protection and conservation. So large-scale deforestation has really become synonymous with farming in the Amazon. And if you're running a monoculture operation, that means right now you have easier access to credit and tax incentives. You can buy machinery at huge scale in order to get better deals. Isabel also told me that land which has been deforested is worth more. And yet it's the smallholder farmer who is locked out of this system, and yet so incredibly important to Brazil. Smallholder farmers provide 70% of the food that the country eats. And so Isabel really described to me these conflicting issues as, in many ways, a lifestyle crisis. And you can certainly see how the system is stacked against smallholder farmers who have the potential to operate in much more sustainable ways if we can change the incentive structure. So in my conversation with Isabel, I wanted to go into a bit more depth to really discover how Belterra, her company, has taken on this challenge and in particular really grappled with new innovations to the way the system needs to be financed. Belle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Haley. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope I can share some valuable insights.
Firstly, I just wanted to unpack one of the key challenges this model takes head on, which is around upfront capital. It's such a key barrier for farmers. So how does Belterra change that equation?
So although agroforestry systems are, we believe, the way to go towards tackling deforestation and improving people's livelihoods and our environmental systems, it's not cheap to implement. When you are thinking about multiple crops, you are thinking about multiple ways to manage crops. You have to have very expert solutions for each one of them. So it's easier for you to find someone that's expert in corn than to find someone that's an expert in a system with 25 varieties of food. And also to manage a system, we know it's much harder than to manage something that's linear. So it has its challenges, and at the end comes down to investment. So in the beginning of Belterra, what we realized is that we needed to absorb the upfront risk of the transition. There is a credit line in Brazil called Pronaf Agroecology. It's a credit line on paper meant to support diversified agroecological systems, usually offering rates of around 3 to 5% per year, with a grace period of 2 to 3 years and a repayment horizon of up to 10 years. However, if you think that agroforestry requires upfront investment in planting, soil, technical systems, and income comes usually after the third time, even the grace period would not fit the time the producers would need to have their first revenue-focused crops. And also, from scratch, you are already undergoing interest rates. So it's not something that's as easy for producers to do. So instead of asking farmers to borrow to wait, we're having upfront capital coming from long-term investors, and farmers are paid to implement, to manage the system from start, and financing is structured around the biological timeline of the land and not the calendar of a bank. So this turns agroforestry from a debt-driven gamble, potentially, into a viable, productive transition. So this is how we see this as a just transition, the way that we can ensure that everyone is coming, but the risks are not on the hands of the ones that are trying to do the hard job.
Incredible. So really taking what is quite a long-term time horizon, particularly for smallholder farmers who feed about a third of the world with, under 2 hectares or less, so that they essentially start making income from year one. That is the incentive we need for farmers to transition to these more sustainable, regenerative approaches. You mentioned investors there, and I'm glad you did, because as you say, Belterra has built its model so that it takes essentially the upfront risk, the upfront cost investments. But I know, as Belterra's head of financial innovation, you've had to bring a lot of creativity to the table in terms of how to make that work also for the company. So would love if you could unpack a little what role blended finance has to play in making agroforestry really viable at scale.
When we talk about blended finance, we are talking about structuring a financial model that has different capital sources, usually public, philanthropic, and private, each one on its own terms, each one with its own goals, in a way that you can get to a financial agreed goal in general. So it does play a critical role in making it viable because today there is no single type of capital naturally aligned with how the systems work. Agroforestry has long timelines, complex systems. The returns do not fit the standard risk models. So for most investors, it still looks unfamiliar, hard to guarantee, difficult to underwrite. So this is where blended finance becomes essential. In practice, what we see today is that philanthropic and concessional capital are often the first movers. This is actually how Belterra started, from philanthropic capital, and they help absorb the early stage risk. They are also funding the technical assistance, which is such a long-term return if you think about long technical assistance investment. But they also support the creation of entirely new structure. So what we're looking at in Brazil, for example, is alternative guarantees. We do have such large programs such as Fundo Clima that comes from international sources of money, but still they are not accepting guarantees such as long-term cacao offtakes. This is something that we would have to offer. So if you're looking at land as a traditional guarantee, but you are working with partnerships with producers, as we do, what guarantees can we use then? So creating these guarantees, ensuring that we are speaking to private, to philanthropic, to public investors, ensuring, for example, things that like first loss layers that ensure that this capital that is coming from the private pockets feels a bit more comfortable on investment is also essential. So let's exemplify with a capital structure that has 3 layers. The first one is a first loss, usually coming from a philanthropic donor. The second one could be from an impact investor. So that's someone that is aiming at pursuing capital gains, but impact gains as well. And let's say the last layer is a market rate return investor, such as a traditional bank. So when we are talking about this structure, usually you say that if something bad happens, if there is an issue of return on this, let's call it a fund, the first one to pay will be the first loss investor. So he or she, or if it is losing its money, the money it has put, but the other investors are not losing the rate that they are getting yet. So you're compromising one part of the capital instead of compromising all layers of it.
And what's been the response from investors to this model?
We are seeing some very brave first, second, and third movers in Brazil. Since I started my job, I feel like I've been having to explain less what we've been doing. And I feel that this is already something very important. But also, I feel that looking at structures such as outcome-based payments, so how can we ensure that producers that are improving the quality of a riverbed can earn money from that just because they're providing ecological ecosystemic support? So we are not only looking at carbon credits, but we are looking at biodiversity credits. We're looking at outcome-based funds. We're looking for alternative guarantees, really diversifying the risk, but also diversifying the sources of benefits that everyone can get from this transition.
A lot of our listeners will be peers in other companies trying to figure out how to make this work in their operating context or industry. And I think one of the most valuable things practitioners can share are how they overcame challenges. What worked? How did they find the leverage needed to overcome a particular barrier?
When I think about starting by the first movers, we had Fundo Vale coming as one of the first movers. We have actually co-produced with them their forestry goal to restore 100,000 hectares of degraded land, but they understood that they would not be able to do that by themselves and not only through one single company. So Belterra started from a part of this goal to be a part of this count in restoring these hectares. But we very quickly realized that we'd need thousands of Belterras actually to be able to do this job, because you take many years, loads of expertise to be able to get to a point where you're restoring 100,000 hectares of degraded land in a productive way, as we do. So one of the starting barriers was thinking, how can we ensure that there are more entrepreneurs also coming to join us in this quest? Fundo Valley started a platform. This means that there are other organizations besides ourselves that are looking at the same goal of restoration, but with different lenses. And what we're doing now is trying to share resources. So I feel like this is quite innovative, but seeing ourselves not as competitors in the space, but as pre-competitive partners. For example, right now we are using at one of our lands, one of our sister companies that is trying to improve the way that we produce cows. We are trying to reduce the amount of methane they emit, and we are importing a product from an Australian partner that is given to the cows, and they reduce the amount of methane that they emit. This is a first mover thing. We are investing in bringing the product to Brazil. This comes from a partner from the Earthshot Prize community, but we are already sharing the resources. We are sharing the experience. And I think the sharing of everything that we do, the good, the bad, the ugly, is what will improve the market as a whole. And I do feel that this is something that we speak about when we talk about sustainability. We talk about collaboration. We talk about partnerships. But I can say that I've been living it here so close to our hearts. Investors trying to speak with international investors, presenting our case studies. We are trying to improve our models to be able to share them with partners as we can. When we talk about these guarantee structures, for example, they're not for Belterra, they're for the market, but we are putting our resources, efforts, and time on it jointly with many people. So I'd say that the biggest learning that we have is that we should count on the ecosystem to ensure that things work as they should.
Well, I hope listeners take that as an open invitation to reach out, to share, to ask questions, to follow up, whether in the agriculture sector and industry itself, investors, even civil society organizations working to support farmers on the grounds, on the front lines. Because again, our excitement with this approach is its potential to make such a dent in global emissions across tropical forest countries, but also the hundreds of millions of farmers around the world that could benefit from really having a stake in the value chain in a very different and much more meaningful way. And that's a nice segue, actually, to bring it back to farmers and to the way they're really built into your model. In many ways, the model is really provoking farmers whose incomes and relationships to the land are changing. So I just really wanted to get your perspective, I guess, on what success looks like at year 1, year 5, year 10 longer term, and whether those definitions of success at this point differ or align between farmers and the financiers backing this model.
So in year 1, what we feel is that success, it's more about food security and about dignity. We are working with producers that were already producing food, but not necessarily in the most sustainable ways for themselves, for their community, or in the most diversified ways so that they can have their income, but also their food from their own production, for example. And they also have more of a predictable income as they start selling this produce. Cassava, banana, very short-term crops. Their relationship with the land usually changes, so they start to see hope in a land where they didn't see before. So we do have some beautiful stories of sons and daughters coming back from university to the land to work on the land. And we know that it's very important for us to have young people on the land, but it's also important for it to be fair and to be adequate so that people want to work there. But we have seen these stories rolling as we've been working, and this starts to happen on year 1. But also for financiers, this is usually where risk starts to decline because you're starting to see the flows of cash still small, but they start to come. And then we have, let's say, year 3 to year 10, this is where we see most of the success, especially when we work with cacao. This is a crop that starts to be harvested on year 4 or 5. So for farmers, it's when you realize that there is long-term livelihood security. You are also accumulating knowledge. So this is also usually when producers become multipliers of knowledge. And you might have seen in tomatoes soup, but people get passionate about it. So they start to share it with their neighbors. And for investors, this is when you see the assets really proving themselves.
Another reason why I find this model so insightful and impactful is not just the incredible, very bottom-up approach you take to giving, farmers self-sufficiency in terms of their own income, livelihoods, the land self-sufficiency, the model's own self-sufficiency. And that's in part because of the way you connect it to global supply chains. And the story, we unpack a couple of examples of how that works in terms of very large, household name brands like Amazon, the e-commerce giant, Cargill, the agriculture behemoth, Natura, the Brazilian but very well-known global cosmetics brand, all of whom have partnered at different times in different ways. Could you just explain kind of in a nutshell how some of those large companies I mentioned and many others can start to think about this approach to land use within their own supply chain approaches?
They are essential. They are pivotal for what we've been developing, because you can only guarantee to producers that producing is safe if they have someone to sell their products to. We can start from many places, but if we start from the buyer, and if we start by establishing this large, secure, long-term offtake agreements, then we can provide safety net for this producer that it doesn't matter if he's only producing on the 3rd, 4th, 5th year, because his soil was very degraded, because technical assistance is something that takes long to build. There is someone she can sell to. So we'd really like to see more of these contracts being developed. We'd really like to see more familiarity on big buyers of food, of course, our products, but of what other products in agroforestry systems that are been produced as well, to understand that they have a very important role. And of course, we also wanted to be able to have this product being sold with a premium, because we know how tough and we know the amount of work and investment was put into producing them. We know that the market is evolving in this direction, but we see not only with the off-takers like Cargill, but also the off-takers of carbon, that there is also an incentive of developing a market for this product. So we see Amazon not only as a carbon buyer, but also as a carbon market maker, if this makes sense, because now what it's really trying to do is to ensure that other tech companies, especially in its industry, but that other companies understand how to evaluate a good carbon project, understand how to partner with a carbon provider. And this is a way of teaching the market as well.
Looking ahead, my last question is really what other lessons, if there's one key lesson perhaps from Belterra's experience, that you can share that you think matters most for other countries facing similar challenges at the intersection of deforestation and land use, smallholder livelihoods, and the future imperative?
I feel like the lesson that we have to share is that the goal is huge. There is no way one can do it by itself. It takes a village, and the village is the whole world by now. We really believe that being able to work with a financial system is a critical part to be able to deliver what we need to deliver, but also integrating the public sphere, the private sphere, the corporates, the NGOs. Everyone needs to take its part. And in Brazil, we have been very happy being part of an ecosystem that is flourishing right now. But we'd really like to be able to share experiences and be helpful to other ecosystems. And maybe if there is a lesson to share, is sharing the lesson. Because so many times we see so many beautiful things happening on the ground that never reach anywhere else. So if we are able to tell our stories and ensure that they are resonating, even if it's one person in Indonesia that is going through the same, we know we have made a difference and eventually made that ecosystem a little bit stronger.
Fascinating to hear that from Isabel about how Belterra took on multiple challenges through such a collaborative approach. Hayley, what do you think then are the top takeaways for business or for people working in sustainability?
I mean, for me, there's really three that sit at kind of the core of everything Belterra is doing and has such incredible potential for replicability and scale in other tropical forest countries. Fundamentally, Belterra is really trying to prove that regenerative models and regenerative agriculture reduces risk, not the opposite. And really proving that the current system of monoculture and deforestation are creating climate and financial instability. Whereas agroforestry is really restoring land while diversifying income, much like a lower risk portfolio. So I think that regeneration is actually reducing risk is the first and most fundamental. But for that to work, secondly, finance really needs to match nature's timeline. So farmers can't be the ones carrying that upfront risk. And in fact, we need patient blended capital to absorb that early risk in order to let the value really build over time. And so third, and finally, but connected to those first two, is that we already have the solutions. What we need is alignment. We know how to restore land at scale. What's missing is that we really need policy, markets, and finance to reward resilience. And that requires connecting people, land, and capital.
Thanks, Hayley. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. If you want to hear more examples of successful just transitions, head to just-stories.org. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to IHRB.org.